And these gaps matter because when experts and the public disagree about risks, there's confusion. People can end up doing something that actually puts them more at risk. You don't make policy for the people at the extremes. You take them into account. You think about how to accommodate them and build their views into the policy. But the policy has to reflect, or ideally it would reflect, the views of the majority. We tend to try to kind of scrub out the probability part. And rather than saying, oh, well, we recognize that it was highly unlikely and it did happen, we think, well, because it was possible, it was inevitable. Let's think about the example of evacuation in the case of an incoming cyclone. Some people refuse to evacuate. And from the outsider's point of view and from the expert's point of view, I think that's ridiculous. They haven't understood the nature of the risk. Let's tell them more about the nature of the risk, and then they will evacuate the way we've told them to. But one of the reasons that people don't evacuate is because of...
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Olivia Jensen, Deputy Director of the Institute of the Public Understanding of Risk, or IPUR to its friends, based out of the National University of Singapore. Olivia is a social scientist specialising in water and environmental policy with a focus on urban Asia. She joined IPUR in 2018 to oversee the Institute's work related to environment and climate, and was appointed Deputy Director in 2023. Before joining IPUR, she was a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Water Policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. At IPUR, she partners with government agencies and international organisations to develop and deliver policy-relevant research. Current projects include collaborative assessment of urban water risks, public and expert perceptions of climate risks and responses, and the design of intervention to close these perception gaps. Past projects have included a focus on flood and sea level risk rise in Asian cities and the role that citizen science is playing in assessing and managing environmental risks. Olivia holds a PhD and MSc in development from both London School of Economics and a BA in Politics, Philosophy and Economics from the University of Oxford. Olivia, welcome to Data Malarkey.
Hi Sam, thank you.
It's great to have you with us. Now, I trust that was a good summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything I've got wrong?
I think you've got it about right.
Very good. Okay, so before we focus on data, I want to ask you a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about your work. So tell me, Olivia, how do you spend your time?
I spend my time trying to understand the connections between things and people. I spend my time asking lots of questions of people, particularly fun when those people are leading very different lives from your own, going to different places, observing things, reading, and then trying to piece it all together in my writing. The other thing that I love and spend time on is dancing. I think even you're going to have trouble making a link between that and data. But I've tried out lots of different types of dancing, and this year I'm focusing on the tango.
Very good. Well, I'm sure there's, there are many people that tell me that music is basically mathematics. So I'm sure that in order to keep time, there's certainly a data aspect there. Very good. Very interesting. Well, good luck with the tango. Can you tell us a little bit more about your own research and current passion projects?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thanks. So one of the main lines of research, and you hinted at this already in the introduction, that we have at IPUR, is trying to understand and sort of ultimately close the gaps between the way that experts perceive risks and the way that publics do. And these gaps matter because when experts and the public disagree about risks, or either how big they are, how important they are, or what to do about them, one thing that happens a lot is that there's confusion. People can end up doing something that actually puts them more at risk when they're trying to do something to protect themselves. It also drives up the costs of monitoring and enforcement of policies and regulation. Think of how much easier it would be and how much money could be saved if everybody just followed the rules on road safety or occupational safety, just because they agreed about what the risks were and what the appropriate action was. And I think in more extreme cases, it leads to conflict or to deadlock. And the result is that some risks just don't get managed at all. In the US, for example, there's been no permanent facility for nuclear waste disposal for decades and decades. And that's because government agencies and the public and experts can't agree about what the appropriate way is to manage these risks. But the result is that nuclear waste is piling up in temporary facilities that aren't as well suited to managing these risks on a long-term basis. And of course, we can think of lots and lots of examples from COVID and others of public health risks where you had direct conflicts between authorities and the public at sometimes direct cost to health and safety. So how do we close this gap? And what are we doing in terms of research? Part of what we're trying to do is to think about how we can measure it. How do we think about the scale, the severity, and also the importance of these gaps? Like, where do we focus our research efforts? And just that leaves us with lots of questions and lots to think about. And then we've also got to think about how to close the gap. And so part of it, of course, is informing the public and trying to get people to understand the risks better. But I think it's also about trying to get experts to understand how the public thinks and how sometimes there might be, very good reasons why the public perceives risks differently from the way experts do. Their values, their priorities might be different. An expert faces, they think about one risk. Let's say you're an expert on wildfires. And those risks very well. And so for you, it's perfectly obvious that you should prioritize that risk, and here are some appropriate actions. But as an individual, we face a landscape of risks. And natural hazards like wildfires are important, but also there's a whole gamut of health risks that might affect us and our loved ones. There's road safety. What about an unemployment risk? What about our job security? And so as individuals, we're constantly juggling and trying to work out how to prioritize our efforts, both in understanding and reacting and managing risks, which the expert doesn't have to do. So we find that quite a lot of our time and effort is spent on trying to sort of communicate back to experts why the public, why individuals might think about risks the way that they do.
Very, very interesting.
Cool. If I've got time, I'll just talk about one other project that's really very much a passion project for me right now, which is it's called Risk Know-How. And this is a partnership with Sense About Science and supported by the Lloyd's Register Foundation. What this project is all about is trying to support a group of people who we call frontline risk communicators. So these are people who sometimes by choice or sometimes by default are playing the role of trying to digest, translate, transmit scientific risk information to the communities where they work, maybe about health risks, could be about climate or environment or other issues, cybersecurity perhaps. And these people, it's not their job title. It's probably not even in their job description to do this. They might be a religious leader or a nurse or an agricultural extension officer. And yet part of a very important part of what they're doing is communicating about risks to others. And at the moment, these people don't necessarily see themselves that way, and they don't know and don't necessarily have access to this great kind of body of both academic knowledge as well as practice from other bits of the world about how other people have faced similar things before, and here are some of the things that have proven to be effective. So what we want to do with the platform is to collect, to synthesize some of this knowledge and to make it available to people in a as open and easily accessible way as possible, as well as give them the chance to ask questions to others like them around the world or to specialists, and for us then to help get in touch with those people to help provide answers for them. So this is something that we just launched last month, and we're really hoping that this can sort of gain momentum over the coming months and years, so that we can get this information, this knowledge to the people who need it.
Very good. Really, really interesting partnership. And as loyal listeners to Data Malarkey will know, we featured Tracy Brown, the director of long-time director of Sense About Science, on a recent episode. So that's a really comprehensive introduction. Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of your institute itself, the Institute of the Public Understanding of Risk?
Sure, absolutely. So IPUR has been running for a bit more than 5 years now, and we have a long name, which you managed beautifully, but I think it conveys pretty well what we work on. So it's public understanding, it's risk perceptions of the public, as well as risk communication. And our big aim is to help people, so individuals, but also could be organizations, to make better decisions in the face of risk. And so that better is a term that we'd better look into a bit more. What do we mean by better decisions? And we don't mean just getting people to do what experts think they ought to do. What we mean is that people should have the information that they need, and they should have the capacity to interrogate it, to understand it, and to use it to take decisions. Structurally, we're a university research institute, so we do the sorts of things that you would expect a university institute to do. We write grant proposals, we do studies, and we write them up and try to get them published in scholarly journals. But we have this sort of second performance metric, which is impact. And the idea is that the work that we do really should be useful to people. And so we work closely with government agencies in Singapore and some other countries around the region, as well as international organizations, on sort of specific risks. For me, that involves like water-related risks, the energy transition, my colleagues working more on health risks and technology risks, to try to improve the quality of risk information that's going out, and also to explore a range of risk communication interventions. So we're not just trying to help government agencies design nice posters or websites. We're thinking also about long-term public engagements, artworks, community walks. And what we want to do is to impose the same kind of scientific rigor in our assessment of these interventions as we do in other areas of science, to assess them and to find out what works.
Impact is something that's very, very close to my heart, to our heart in our business. My wife and business partner runs a whole division that works just with academics to help them to find and express the real world impact in the context in the UK. But I know it's a model that's used elsewhere of the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. So I'm always fascinated when earwigging on her work, and indeed collaborating with her and some of her university clients, how much further advanced the world of research and academia and institutes such as yours, how much further advanced that world is versus the commercial world in terms of impact. Where in the commercial world, I mean, obviously there are kind of financial performance metrics, but the real world impact, how you're changing lives, how you're changing policies, I think is a very, very important strand of work, but also something from which I think industry and government, indeed, could learn an awful lot. So really, really, really good to hear that that's an integral part of your work. I know that you're based in Singapore. And you're endowed by the National University of Singapore, and also you mentioned already the Lloyd's Register Foundation. Can you explain a little bit about the not the technicalities of the funding, but kind of why there is this partnership and why you're based where you are?
Sure. So IPUR has this joint endowment from the Lloyd's Register Foundation and from NUS. And the Lloyd's Register Foundation, so that's a charitable foundation, and their aim is to make the world a safer place. So they support research and education on engineering safety in general, so safety at work, safety of physical infrastructure, and so on. But I think 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was a recognition there that the human element is extremely important in managing risk. And you could make the physical environment extremely safe. But as long as there were people interacting with it, there was still going to be health and safety risks. And I think coming out of that, there was a desire on their part to support a research institute which would work specifically on this area, on this, so the interaction between people and risks and the way that people perceived risks. And Singapore, I think, was an ideal place for them to support the foundation of this institute. We're in a region which is undergoing demographic, economic, technological change at such a pace and such a scale that many of these risks, which we're most interested in, are kind of concentrated here and affecting billions of people in this region. And yet, a lot of the research that was being almost all of the research that was being done on risk perception and risk communication was being done at universities in the US, to a lesser extent Europe, and a few other places. And so it seems to me very sort of persuasive that we should have a research capability in the region that's capable of responding to the priorities and the needs of the region, and also just to make sure, just to check that we're not missing something about risk perception and risk communication that could be related to culture and different systems of government, if we're going to want to translate some of the findings of the existing scholarship into other regions. And so I hope that we're able to sort of contribute to that effort of internationalizing the scholarship on risk perception.
You've hinted at this already. I think it's a really interesting challenge, motivating behavior change, communicating risk effectively. Can you tell me why you believe it has historically been and maybe continues to be so difficult to communicate risk to the general public?
I'm not 100% sure that it is that difficult. I'm wondering whether we think it's difficult partly because people don't do what experts think they ought to do. So we're sort of saying, oh, they must be doing that because they don't know, there's an information gap, or because they don't understand. But perhaps it's because there are other things that are motivating them. Perhaps, well, a very straightforward one is that people have resource constraints. So, you want people to go and get a vaccine, and they don't go and get a vaccine, and you think, well, that's because they haven't understood the importance of the vaccine. But it could just be something much more straightforward, that they don't have the time to go when the vaccine center happens to be open, or they don't have an accessible, reasonable, cheap transport option that can get them there. So on the one hand, we've got these sort of straightforward sort of time and money constraints, which stop people from doing things to mitigate risks, which experts think they ought to do. But maybe a bigger point also is that people prioritize risks differently. So from the experts' point of view, it's saving lives, maybe preventing damage to property. So you've got a couple of easy metrics like fatalities and damage in terms of in monetary terms. And if you look at it, let's think about the example of evacuation in the case of an incoming cyclone. And some people refuse to evacuate. And from the outsider's point of view and from the expert's point of view, I think that's ridiculous. They haven't understood the nature of the risk. Let's tell them more about the nature of the risk, and then they will evacuate the way we've told them to. But one of the reasons that people don't evacuate is because of their pets. And pets aren't allowed. You aren't allowed in many cases to bring your pets with you to the evacuation center. And if you think about it in personal terms, if you have a dog or maybe a cat that you're very attached to, and you think it won't be able to survive because you haven't been told how long you're going to have to evacuate for, and you're worried about it, then you might well think twice. Or 3 times. You might well think, well, maybe I'll just see if I can get away with it this time, because if I don't, I'm pretty sure that my dog is going to suffer and maybe not survive. So when we bring it to that personal level and we think about how we value and prioritize lots of different things, not just our own safety, then it's easier to understand why people might sort of not do what they're told to. And it's not because we haven't understood the risk. It's because we've thought about the risk and then we've thought about the costs and the benefits of the protective action that's being presented to us. And we think it's not worth it. So I think if we look at the studies, for example, on why people do or don't take protective actions, what motivates them much more is their perceptions of the effectiveness and the costs and benefits of the action, more than their perceptions of the risk. So maybe what's going on is not that people are not good at understanding risks. It's just that they're taking into account much more information and many other considerations, which experts are not.
I think that's really interesting. It's really interesting to see what the world of behavioural science, behavioural economics in particular, has shown that we're not kind of satisficers. We're not Homo economicus. We're predictably irrational. We make decisions emotionally as well as rationally. And just because all logic says that we shouldn't take our cat, actually my cat Quincy, is sitting on the sofa, even now, very much an office cat. If there was a cyclone, would I want to find him first? Very probably yes. No, I completely get that. Now, listen, you hinted about vaccine there, that there could be time and resource constraints that maybe led some people not to get vaccinations. Let's inevitably have a little look at COVID. What do you think that we've learned from the COVID years about how to communicate risk and uncertainty effectively?
I'm not quite sure how much we've learned. It seems to me that now that COVID's over, that in other domains, some of the lessons haven't quite translated. But let me talk a little bit about what I hope we've learned, perhaps. I think one point is to give people the information they need. So it needs to be timely. People are not in a position to wait for the cycle of kind of academic analysis. People were very thirsty for information much throughout the pandemic, and being able to provide that to them, on a website that got updated every day with the latest information, with in a format that they found that was just easy to read off. And then I think really importantly, that people were able to find themselves in the risk information. So I'm a woman of a certain age. I have an underlying health condition. What's the risk to me of a serious case of COVID, of hospitalization, of death? And what's the risk to me of taking the vaccination and different types of vaccinations? So being able to find yourself, your identity in the risk information, I think was very important to people. And I'm not sure that we see that in other domains now, whether it's possible for people faced with another kind of health risk to go and find that information that fits their profile. But I think that was something that did get done during COVID, and I hope that it could be replicated and sort of just become a standard thing. I think there was also recognition, at least in some places and some of the time, to sort of meet people where they were at, to understand the constraints that people faced, to understand maybe the sort of mental models, perhaps surrounding vaccination and the role of pharmaceutical companies and things, which lay behind some of their instinctive reactions, and still to communicate with them, to recognize that as maybe it wasn't something you agreed with, but to recognize that that was their starting point, and then to try to talk to them from there about what the sort of risks and benefits, both of the disease and also of the vaccinations were, or other protective actions like wearing a mask. So not just communicating to this sort of ideal member of the public who's like a clean slate and loves science and is happy to receive the whatever information you want to give them, but recognizing that people are not clean slates. People start with models and in some cases sort of preferences, which are going to affect their responses, and thinking, okay, then it's my job as the risk communicator to work out how to nevertheless provide this person with useful information and something that they feel they can use. And then I think also in some places and at the best times, there was also recognition and some experience in communicating about uncertainty. So saying, here are some of the things we don't know yet, but given that we don't know, we're recommending this policy, or we're going to implement this restriction. And it may change, because right now we're collecting more information, it's very fast evolving, and it may change a couple of weeks down the line. We commit to constantly reviewing the information and constantly updating our policy. I mean, if only that had been kind of translated into the way that we handle lots of risks, and I don't really think that it has. But the idea that the scientists might commit to kind of regularly updating the scientific information, making that available to decision makers, and decision makers committing to regularly reviewing the scientific information, so we could be sure that whatever regulations, rules, laws, recommendations were in place really reflected the latest scientific understanding of, let's say, a health risk.
I think that there are a number of examples I'd like to get to a sense of if you have any kind of local or indeed global examples of those who shall we say had a good pandemic. The recent guest on this show, Professor David Spiegelhalter from what was then the Winton Centre for Communicating Risk. I think it would be fair to say that kind of nationally and globally had a good pandemic. I like to think, John Hopkins did a good job with the data. David McCandless, the guy who runs the Information is Beautiful, if you know that data visualization community, there was some really interesting guidance there. But who do you think got it right? Are there any institutes or national or transnational organizations that you think got it more right than wrong?
I spent the pandemic in Singapore, and feel that the Singapore government did a lot right during COVID. And I think they did many of the things that I was just talking about. Very early on in the pandemic, they set up a website which was updated daily. It was updated with cases, fatalities, hospitalizations. So you could track the number of people in hospital in Singapore for COVID throughout the whole pandemic period. So there's a very high level of transparency, and I think that gave people a lot of confidence. The other thing that the government then did with that was to connect that evidence base up to the policies that they were introducing. So there was a clear relation that was made for the public between these things, the rate of infection, say, and the policy that was being implemented and the recommendations that were being made in terms of masking, social distancing, working from home, and so on. So it was a great example of evidence-based policymaking that was happening in front of people. And I think that definitely helped people to understand the more difficult bits of the pandemic when those regulations were very stringent. Another thing they got right was that there was just a single consistent message from all the agencies of government. That may be harder or easier to achieve depending on the scale of a country, but there was something that was very conscious here, and it was very consistently followed. And so, of course, that again helps people to maintain trust, maintain confidence, and to avoid sort of confusion in people's minds about like who to follow, who do I listen to. So I thought that was again, a very strong positive point here. Then when it came to the stringency of the measures and how long they went on, I must say that there were times, particularly as we kind of got into the second year of the pandemic, when I felt that the measures were too stringent. But when we saw survey results, it was clear that the plurality of people in Singapore thought that the government was getting it about right. And then there was a minority of people kind of like me who thought it was too stringent. But then there was a minority of people on the other end of the scale who thought that it was too lax and who wanted stricter regulations. So I think you don't make policy for the people at the extremes. You take them into account. You think about how to accommodate them and build their views into the policy. But the policy has to reflect, or ideally it would reflect, the views of the majority. And then it was clear that in Singapore that most people felt comfortable with the stringency of the measures. I'm not sure whether that was true elsewhere. I think it might well have been, but there was lots of attention to the extremes. So maybe it drowned out some of what we would have seen if we thought about, well, what's the sort of plurality or the majority in the middle thinking about this. But it was clear that here the stringency of the measures that were introduced did reflect basically what the population felt was appropriate. So again, I think that's a very strong point for the Singapore pandemic.
So yes, I doubt that there is a whole kind of months and years of soul searching going on in Singapore currently, then, as there is in the UK with the COVID inquiry and the kind of the haphazard, chaotic communication that was often self-serving. I don't imagine that there were endless parties that have subsequently been come out and been dramatised. But if that's what it's like over here. Now, listen, I call myself a data storyteller, joining narrative and numbers together to be kind of influential and to tell stories that clearly reflect the truth and are going to drive people and motivate people to action. What do you believe is the best way to combine narratives and numbers and stories and statistics? Because clearly you're dealing with relative and absolute risk and confidence intervals and so on. How do you believe that we can become more impactful data storytellers?
It's an interesting and difficult one. And I think you're absolutely hitting on the crucial point, which is that we have to combine the two. Because often when we're talking to kind of scientists or our domain experts, we're more pushing them towards the narrative. But I'm really conscious of the fact that when it comes to risk, there is a tension between using narratives and then communicating risks, precisely because the narrative form invites us to draw causal links, to see this nice flow from the initial trigger right through to what kind of happens eventually. And of course, risk is not like that, right? It's the opposite. It's that we started here, but completely by chance, because we rolled the dice this way, we ended up with this outcome. And so kind of difficult by, let's say, picking a single story or a couple of stories about individuals, which might be very compelling to the audience, but that could definitely end up with the audience perhaps leaving with an over-exaggerated perception of that risk, because, well, they've just heard a story about the rare but tragic case in which somebody had, let's say, a very unusual reaction to a medical treatment. And if that's the only story you hear, then you might come away thinking, well, that's kind of maybe not that likely, but still kind of likely, without being able to kind of put a probability on it and have a sense of the likelihood of maybe that happening to you or somebody that you love. So I suppose that kind of storytelling is much more effective when we're trying to introduce to people to give them some understanding about a neglected risk. So if the tendency of the individual is to sort of underestimate a risk, and we can tell them a story, they can see, okay, that's happened to that person who's not too different from me. Maybe it could happen to me too. I think also the sort of narrative part can be very effective when we look at protective action. So, there's a wonderful case of a series by BBC Media Action, which was about communities in Bangladesh and how they could protect themselves, the sorts of things that they could do in their communities to become more resilient to natural hazards and sort of broadly to climate change. And so it was like a sort of DIY program in which, each week you would see a community kind of build stuff together and as a result, have a higher level of protection from cyclones or sort of extreme weather. And there, people were able to see in those stories of sort of ordinary communities, people with the same access to the same sort of materials that they had, they were able to see, okay, so it's possible for me. And I think that then was very sort of empowering and then very good at sort of triggering people to take action themselves. So I think those things are very positive. I think the most problematic kind of storytelling is really when we're looking back at something that happened and trying to tell a story about it. I'm thinking of an example like a train crash, which absolutely invites something that psychologists call hindsight bias, which is that when we're looking back at something, we're looking for a story. And the reality might be that, four very unlikely different things happened, and they all happened on the same day, on the track of the same train, and as a result, there was a train crash. And they were very improbable, but they did happen, and they happened together. But when we look backwards on that, we tend to try to kind of scrub out the probability part. And rather than saying, oh, well, we recognize that it was highly unlikely and it did happen, we think, well, because it was possible, it was inevitable, right? Because it was possible, it was bound to happen because these checks weren't done or that part wasn't replaced and so on. And so by telling stories about disasters that have happened in the past, I think we make it even more problematic for ourselves to parse out the probability bit from the causal narrative that we often kind of find the easiest to understand and to use when we're talking about these things. Sorry, but you're not talking about that. You're talking about putting the two together, and that's the crucial bit. And I think that's it's very hard. And I hope that we'll see kind of more examples of it that we can bring in and develop and share and so on. But the idea that you might have a newspaper article which has that, the story of a couple of different individuals, and running alongside that the charts that say, well, this individual belongs to this group, which makes up so much of the proportion of the relevant population. This individual is a more likely case. Could you do that? Does it still work? I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether then you lose part of the power of the narrative, or whether you manage to combine the strengths of both approaches. So, one more general point I think on the question is I think we can make both narratives and the presentation of data much more effective by taking the perspective of the person we're trying to communicate to. And so when we're thinking about giving them data, rather than thinking, what data do I have available and do I want to share, we think, what data do they need? What's the decision they're trying to take? And what data do they need? And often there's like a huge mismatch between these two things. It happens also, I don't know, if now and again when you have a health problem and you think, okay, I'm going to go try and read some of the academic literature to find out about this. And days later, you're still drowning in the papers trying to make sense of it, even if you're super motivated and you've studied stats yourself and so on. So sometimes it can be extremely difficult just to find the data that answers your specific question. And I think as data storytellers, if we can, maybe it means that we have to make lots of different stories for lots of different individuals, but the extent to which we can do that, and we have time to do that we can tailor the information and the story to the needs and the specific circumstances of the individual we're communicating to, the more effective it will be.
So much richness in the answer. The vital importance of knowing and understanding your audience and speaking with the data tolerance that they're likely to have. Your Bangladesh story, that BBC story about the information about it's not enough just to give information to people. You need to give them the information, the motivation, and the behavioural skills. And then the whole kind of hornet's nest. You mentioned hindsight bias, but kind of thinking about all of the. I mean, what are there more than 100 different cognitive biases that we're struggling against, be it confirmation or the availability heuristic. I've just seen a fire engine, there must be a fire. Oh, there's another fire engine, the whole town must be on fire. So yes, I think in communicating risk, in communicating uncertainty, in communicating data generally, we are constantly struggling with these attentional shortcuts, these biases, these heuristics that can take us into take those that we're communicating into very, very different and unintended areas. But that was extremely rich. If you were creating a school curriculum for data literacy and how to understand risk, what would you include as, say, the 3 most important topics or themes that we should cover in that school curriculum?
Oh, well, yes, please. I would love that opportunity. Okay. I think I would try to make it very practical. So I would think, when is it that young people who, as they get older, kind of run into risk information and have to take a decision themselves to deal with it? So I think the first thing the first topic or theme would be, how do you use risk information to take decisions? And I would scout around for a whole bunch of examples of posters and websites and newspaper articles and stuff where there's risk information, and I would invite the students to take a look at it and to think about how we interrogate it and we understand it. So that could be, on the one hand, okay, sometimes we've got to make a bit of a mental effort to think about probabilities, especially some of the more kind of challenging aspects of probabilities, like cumulative probabilities. So here it's telling me what's going to happen in any particular year, but actually what I want to know is it going to happen to me over my lifetime? So how do we understand that? Or conditional probabilities. So here it's telling me what's going to happen if this other thing also happens. So how do I understand those? And that's very much kind of sort of risk literacy kind of focus. And then I would broaden it out a bit and say, how do we deal with information which is, inherently uncertain? And there I would want the students to have a sort of healthy skepticism towards risk claims. Think, do I trust this data? Do I trust the source of the data? If it's health data, what sort of study was it based on? Was it like an epidemiological study? Is this basically about correlations, or was this a randomized control trial in which I can be more confident of the causal nature of the claim that's being discussed? And then, even bigger than that, the difference between significance as the statistician understands it and significance the way the rest of us understand it. Like, okay, it's different, but is it different enough to matter? So you found from a statistical point of view that these two groups are different from one another, but is the effect size big enough for it to matter to the decision that I take? Okay, so that would be theme 1. Theme 2 would be about how we talk to other people about risks. Because, well, some of these decisions are individual ones, but a lot of the time we're bumping up against other people who have different views about a risk from ourselves, and we have to find a way to talk to them and to come to some kind of agreement about whether a thing is a high risk or a low risk and what we should do about it together. And I'm thinking here about parents with teenage children having a discussion about, is it risky to go out late at night? And the usual format of the discussion is, yes, it is, no, it isn't, yes, it is, no, it isn't. How do you move on from that? And how do we understand these differences and find a way to agree or accommodate each other's views? And I think that starts with perhaps, well, let's agree on the question. What's this what's the definition of the risk that we're talking about? What's the nature of the harm? To whom? And do we share an evidence base that we could both refer confidently to? So if we're going to assess this risk together, what information do you think we need in order to assess the risk? And is that different from me? So if we can have that, if we can have a common definition of the scope of the risk, and we can have a shared evidence base, well, we still might disagree about prioritization, we still might disagree about trade-offs, but we've come a lot closer to understanding each other's positions. And I think, well, hopefully we also get a bit closer to an accommodation. And then I think the third theme would be about how we as citizens engage in public debates about risk. And this would be more about trying to get people to be more involved. Because I think most of us, most of the time, are not thinking about the risks that we face and all the measures that are in place to protect us from those. I mean, we're surrounded by a web of safety regulation related to, the water we drink and the food we eat and the transport we use and how that's protected. I mean, we might get mildly irritated sometimes by having to take our shoes off at the airport because of security risk, or or just scoff at that note on the coffee cup which says caution, contents may be hot. But most of the time we're pretty happy just to kind of ignore all the work that goes into assessing risks and coming up with regulations that are an appropriate response to those risks. And there are all those regulatory agencies out there which are filled with often, very conscientious people taking high quality scientific advice and trying to do that for us. And it's only when something goes wrong, when there's a crisis, that suddenly we focus our attention on them and we say, you've been doing a terrible job. And the result of that is often that, politicians and sometimes, fueled by public opinion, triggers some kind of change in regulation, to make it more stringent or to change it in a way that imposes very significant costs on society, and maybe brings only a marginal or perhaps no benefit at all. But it's this knee-jerk reaction to, in hindsight, right, with a hindsight bias, to something that's, maybe improbable, but does happen sometimes. And I think if people could understand a bit better how that risk regulation works, who does it, on what basis, what kind of scientific information they use for that, then maybe that could sort of elevate the public debate a bit when it comes to crises, or, ideally not. Ideally, we don't get to the crisis. But when it comes to deciding on regulations and the appropriate level of regulations, and that people could be a little bit more aware of how they don't have to think about risks a lot of the time, because they've effectively delegated that risk management to an agency. And I feel like they should be more interested in that, and more aware of what those regulators do on a regular day.
Very, very good curriculum on conditional probabilities, shared evidence base, and how we engage in public debate. Brilliant, fantastic. Well, when either you or I can find the funding for that, we'll get cracking on that project. No problem at all. Now, finally, Olivia, can you tell us where our listeners can find out about you, about IPUR, about what you're up to online in social media and so on?
Well, I personally am on LinkedIn. That's an easy place to find me. Our IPUR website highlights, so not just my work, but absolutely the work of the team, my colleagues who do really cool things on health and technology and so on. So that would be a good place to look. We actually have an online course on the edX platform called Understanding and Communicating Risk. And that's going to relaunch on the 8th of April. So anybody who would be interested to hear more from me and colleagues and some leading global risk experts on those topics, very welcome to audit or to sign up for that course. And another place that I would definitely recommend for people to look is the Understanding Risk community. That's understandrisk.org, where there are all sorts of resources. A lot of that is related to natural hazards, but also relevant to other sorts of risks of interest. So if you want more reading suggestions, I would also look to the Risk Know-How platform. So that's riskknowhow.org. And also it would be great to get people's sort of suggestions and feedback on all of those. What do you want to know about risk? What data would be useful to you? And then maybe we can see ways to kind of bring you into the platform and work with you.
Brilliant. We will include links to all of those, some new ones definitely on me there in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time, Olivia. Thank you for talking to us about the work that you do. I think if only there were more people with your approach to using data smarter, there'd be rather less malarkey in the world of evidence and risk communication and rather more data-driven common sense. Olivia Jensen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sam. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.